In the summer of 1218, in the dusty heartland of the American plains, 450 men knelt on the parched earth, their hands bound behind their backs. The air was thick with the scent of fear, and the relentless sun beat down on the prairie. These were merchants, traders from across the burgeoning nation, who had traveled thousands of miles, carrying silks from the East Coast, furs from the northern territories, silver, gold, and untold riches. They pleaded for mercy. "Please," one exclaimed in Spanish, the common tongue of the borderlands, "we are just traders. We have families." Above them, on the parapet of the frontier fort, stood Governor Inalchuk, a portly man with cold eyes and a greed as bottomless as the deepest desert well. His fingers tapped nervously on the stone railing. In his mind, he'd already calculated the value of all the goods. It was enough to buy a small principality and make him the wealthiest man in the newly formed union. "Spies," he declared in a flat voice, devoid of any emotion. "You are all agents of the British Crown. No, we swear to God, we are not spies." But Inalchuk had already made his decision. He sent a message to his nephew, President Mohammadu II, inquiring what to do with these merchants. The president's reply was swift and unambiguous. "Kill them. Take everything." The governor raised his hand, and the executioners stepped forward. What followed took several hours. 450 men were beheaded, one by one, their blood soaked into the parched earth. Their goods, these incredible treasures including a gold nugget the size of a bull's neck, were confiscated and divided. Among these goods was a personal gift, from one ruler to another, a gesture of peace. This gesture had been met with a mass execution. Only one man escaped this fate, a camel driver, who managed to slip away in the confusion, fled and ran, covering 1,500 miles of plains and deserts, not stopping until he reached the court of the man who had sent this caravan. His name was Genghis Khan, and when this camel driver told him what had happened, described the executions, the pillaging, the utter disregard for decency, something changed in the Khan's eyes. 3 years later, an entire empire was erased from the face of history. Not defeated, not conquered, erased. This is the story of how one moment of greed and arrogance ignited the most brutal military campaign the medieval world had ever seen. This is the story of the siege of Samarkand, the day the Mongols crushed Persia. Let me introduce you to the main villain of our story. And yes, I call him a villain because after years of studying this period, I can see him no other way. Meet President Mohammadu II, al-Adin. In 128, he ruled the Khwarezmian Empire, an empire stretching from the borders of China to the Persian Gulf. On a map it looks impressive, truly impressive. He controlled Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench, some of the greatest cities on the Silk Road. He called himself the Second Alexander. But here's the thing about Mohammadu II. He was a conqueror who couldn't govern, a warrior who couldn't lead, a president who built his empire on sand. Let me paint a picture. Mohammadu spent 20 years conquering territories from the Seljuks, the Ghurids, anyone he could defeat. By 1217 he controlled everything from the Sir Darya River to the Persian Gulf. Colossal. But, and this is crucial, all these conquests were recent. The people didn't love him, or even like him. According to historian C. Bosworth, his dynasty was deeply unpopular and a focal point of popular hatred. In none of the provinces they ruled had the Khwarezm Shahs ever managed to forge a unity of interest between themselves and their subjects. Think about that. You rule a vast empire, and nobody actually wants you there. And it gets worse. Mohammadu didn't trust his own generals. He didn't trust his own advisors. He didn't even fully trust his own sons, except for Jalal al-Din, his eldest, who was arguably the only competent military mind in the entire family. And Mohammedu's mother, Turkan Khatun, known as the Queen of the Turks, still held immense power in the empire, creating what historians called an uneasy co-regency. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and Mohammadu constantly provided them. In 1217, he tried to march on Baghdad to force the caliph to recognize him as president. What happened? His army was caught in a blizzard in the Zagros Mountains. Thousands of his soldiers froze to death. He had to retreat, humiliated. The first red flag. Then there's how he devastated his own cities. In 1212, when Samarkand rebelled, he massacred 10,000 inhabitants in retaliation. When he later passed through Nishapur, he even had to ask the inhabitants to rebuild the walls that his own father had destroyed during an earlier conquest. He was defending cities he himself had raised. The second red flag. But the biggest problem was his strategy. When he heard about the growing Mongol threat to the east, when his advisors told him about a general named Genghis Khan who had just conquered northern China and was now eyeing Central Asia, Muhammadu made a catastrophic decision. He decided to spread his troops thin, placing garrisons in every significant city: Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, Balkh, Otrar. All these cities received soldiers with orders to defend in place. Why? He anticipated a standard Mongol raid, the kind the nomads had done for centuries: an invasion, the pillaging of the countryside, the avoidance of cities, and a retreat. The president believed the Mongols were just another group of steppe nomads, dangerous, certainly, but incapable of dealing with his fortified cities. He had no idea what awaited him. 1,500 miles to the east, Genghis Khan was creating something the world had never seen. He had united the Mongol tribes, something nobody before him had done. He built an army based on merit, not on lineage. His generals were the best fighters, not nobles. His army displayed a discipline that would have made the legions of Rome envious. And here's the key point. Genghis Khan had just spent years conquering northern China, fighting the Jin dynasty. He had learned siege warfare from Chinese engineers. The Mongols were no longer just horse archers. They had become a combined arms force, with cavalry, siege engines, and engineers capable of taking any fortress. However, in 1218, Genghis Khan was not seeking war with the Khwarezmian Empire. His army, depleted from years of campaigning in China, needed rest, and his empire needed consolidation. He desired trade and commerce. According to Persian historian Minhaj al-Siraj, Genghis Khan sent a message to Muhammadu: "I am the ruler of the lands of the rising sun, and you rule the lands of the setting sun. Let us forge a strong pact of friendship and peace." This was a genuine offer. The Mongols had always been interested in both war and trade. They preferred to control the Silk Road through alliance rather than conquest. Earn money, they paid with lives. Muhammadu received this message and, remarkably, responded with an agreement for trade relations. The war that would soon erupt, the empire that would be destroyed, the hundreds of thousands of lives that would be extinguished, none of this had to happen. In the spring of 1218, 500 camels set out from the Mongol court, heading west. Each carried 400 pounds of goods. Do the math. That's 200,000 pounds of treasure: gold, silver, Chinese silk that shimmered like water, sable furs from Siberia, so soft they flowed like liquid, jade, ivory, goods worth a king's ransom. But this caravan was led by 450 Muslim merchants, because Genghis Khan had deliberately chosen Muslim traders for a mission into a Muslim empire. This was shrewd diplomacy. Among them also was one Mongol official, an envoy bearing gifts, including that gold nugget the size of a camel's neck. The caravan was in high spirits. They were about to get rich. The Silk Road was reopening, with the Mongols controlling the eastern end and the Khwarezmians controlling the western. Trade was about to blossom. These men were in a position that promised them untold wealth. In the summer of 1218, they reached Otrar. Otrar, located on the Syr Darya River in modern-day Kazakhstan, was a frontier city, a major trading hub, a place where caravans from China divided to head either west, to Europe, or south, to Persia. It was governed by Inalchuk, known by his title Gyur Khan, who was also the uncle of President Muhammadu II. Inalchuk sees this caravan arrive. 500 camels, hundreds of merchants, goods that would make Croesus himself envious, and he wants it all. This is where the story gets particularly interesting. Some sources claim that one of the merchants made a fatal mistake. He addressed Governor Inalchuk as Inalchuk, which literally means little in all, instead of his proper title, Gyur Khan, which was a sign of disrespect. Others say Inalchuk genuinely believed them to be spies. The border between the Mongols and Khwarezmians was tense. Perhaps he thought it was reconnaissance. But frankly, I think it was simpler. I believe he saw all this wealth and decided he wanted it. Inalchuk orders the entire caravan arrested, accusing them all of espionage. And here's an important detail. He doesn't make this decision alone. He sends a message to his nephew, President Muhammadu II, asking what to do. The president's response is, "Execute them." Let me pause here, because this is important. This is the moment, the turning point, where everything could have gone differently. Muhammadu could have said, "Are you insane? These are merchants under Mongol protection. Send them back with apologies and gifts." He could have punished Inalchuq even for daring to suggest such a thing. He could have understood that the Mongols had just conquered northern China, and it was probably not wise to antagonize them. Instead, he said, "Kill them." At the president's command, all 450 merchants were executed. Inalchuq seized the goods and sent a portion to Muhammadu. The camel drivers, who later managed to escape, reported that the executions took up most of the day. 450 men killed for trying to trade. When the news reaches Genghis Khan, his generals expect him to explode with rage, to declare war immediately and begin mobilization, but he doesn't. Instead, to everyone's shock, he makes another attempt at diplomacy. He sends 3 envoys to Muhammadu, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols. Their message is simple: punish Governor Ilchuq for his crime, pay compensation to the merchants' families, and forget the incident. This is an offer that allows Muhammadu to save face. He can blame Ilchuq entirely, hand him over, pay a little money, and avoid a war with the most formidable military force in Asia. The envoys arrive at Muhammadu's court, expecting negotiations. What happens next is unthinkable. Muhammadu II orders the Muslim envoy beheaded, and then orders his soldiers to shave the beards of the 2 Mongol envoys and send them back to Genghis Khan. If you're unfamiliar with Mongol culture, let me explain. A beard was sacred to a man, a symbol of his masculinity, his honor, and his dignity. To have one's beard shaved was to be utterly humiliated. This was a deliberate, calculated insult, saying, "I'm not just rejecting your offer, I'm spitting on it." The 2 Mongol envoys return to their Khan, beardless, carrying the head of their murdered comrade, and Genghis Khan receives them in his tent. Sources report that he sat for a long time, simply looking at what Muhammadu had sent him, the head of a man who had come in peace, and the humiliated faces of the 2 envoys. Then, and this is confirmed by many sources, Genghis Khan smiled, an unhappy, terrifying smile. He dismissed everyone from his tent, climbed to the top of a nearby mountain, and, according to tradition, prayed alone for 3 days and 3 nights. Descending, he made his decision. He convened his generals and uttered words that would echo through history. "The greatest pleasure is to defeat your enemies, to chase them before you, to deprive them of their possessions, and to see those whom they loved bathed in tears." If you like this story, hit like, because what follows is utterly brutal, and subscribe, because we are going to dive into the military tactics that made this possible. The Mongol war machine is about to be unleashed, and President Muhammadu II, in his arrogance and foolishness, has just guaranteed the destruction of everything he built. But first, Genghis Khan needed to prepare, and that preparation would take months. Months during which Muhammadu could have done so many things differently, but didn't. Autumn of 1219. In the mountains of Mongolia and northern China, the largest military force ever assembled by the Mongols begins to gather. Modern historians estimate it at 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers, though medieval sources inflate it to 200,000 or more. In any case, this is a colossal army. But it's not the size that makes this army terrifying, it's its composition. 60% light cavalry, horse archers capable of shooting their bows at full gallop, shooting backwards during a retreat, having spent their entire lives in the saddle. 40% heavy cavalry, armored shock troops capable of breaking infantry lines like a hammer through glass. And this is what sets them apart from any other nomadic army in history. They have Chinese engineers, over 1,000 men. These engineers know how to build trebuchets, mangonels, and battering rams. They know how to undermine walls. They have methods for using naphtha, essentially medieval napalm, to burn cities. The Khwarezmians thought they were facing a standard nomadic raid. In reality, they were facing the medieval equivalent of a modern joint operations force. Genghis Khan divides his forces into 4 armies, each with a specific objective. Army number 1, under his eldest son, Yochi, will move north along the Sir-Darya River, capturing smaller towns and villages. Army number 2, under Jebi and Subutai, 2 of the greatest generals in Mongol history, commanders who could likely conquer a continent with 1,000 men, will move southeast, creating a pincer movement. Army number 3, under his second and third sons, Chagatai and Ogadai, will lay siege to Otrar, Inalchuq city, the place where it all began. They are going to make an example of it. Army Number 4, under Genghis Khan himself, along with his youngest son, Tolui, and the main force, will target the heart of the empire. This is a masterpiece of strategic planning. 4 separate armies, each capable of operating independently, each supporting the others, designed to overwhelm and confuse the Khwarezmian defenders. Meanwhile, in Samarkand, President Muhammadu II holds council with his generals, and they practically beg him to change his strategy. "My lord," they say, "we have 400,000 soldiers. If we gather them together, march north, and meet the Mongols in open battle, we can crush them. We outnumber them 4 to 1. This is not bad advice. In an open field, with proper coordination, they might even have won. The Khwarezmian army had experienced horsemen, heavy Persian infantry, and yes, war elephants brought from India. However, Muhammadu did not trust his generals. He was exceedingly suspicious of any signs of rebellion. He worried that if all the troops were gathered in one place, someone might use it to depose him. So he makes the fatal decision. "No, we will defend our cities. Place garrisons in every major fortress. Let the Mongols come to us. They are nomads. Siege warfare is unknown to them. They will spend months battering their forces against our walls, and we will destroy them." His generals exchanged glances. Some tried to argue, but Muhammadu was the president, and his word was law. Thus, the army of the Khwarezmian Empire found itself fragmented, 20,000 here, 15,000 there, 30,000 inches Samarkand. Silence. The army as a whole was enormous, but it was divided into isolated units with no coordination. And this is what I want to emphasize. This wasn't just bad strategy. It was catastrophically bad. It violated every principle of warfare. You never divide your forces when facing a superior enemy, and the Mongols were precisely that. Superior, not in numbers, but in cohesion, discipline, and tactical flexibility. Muhammadu II had signed his own death warrant, but he didn't realize it yet. He thought he had made the best and safest decision. His cities were strong, his walls were high. The Mongols, after all, were just nomads who would break themselves against his fortifications like waves against a cliff. He placed the bulk of his forces in Samarkand, his capital, and waited. The Mongol army entered Khwarezmian territory in September 1219. They crossed the Sir Darya River, and the campaign immediately began, but not where Muhammadu expected. In late September 1219, Chagatai and Ogadai approached Otrar with roughly 30,000 warriors. The city sat on a high earthen rampart, a 20-meter-high toba, and had powerful walls and a garrison numbering anywhere from 20,000 to 60,000 men, depending on which source you believe. Modern historians estimate the real number closer to 10,000 to 15,000. And Inalchuk stood on the walls, watching the Mongol army deploy. He knew what was coming. He knew why they were here. After all, he had started this war, and to his credit, and it's hard for me to say this about a man who murdered 450 innocent people, Inalchuk decided to make the Mongols pay for every inch of his city. The siege began, and for the Mongols, it was not going well. Otrar was built on this high elevation, which meant the Mongols had to fight uphill against prepared defenses. Their siege engines had trouble traversing the target. Assaults were repelled with heavy losses. Inalchuk had stockpiled food and water. He was ready for a long siege. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. October, November, December, January, February. For 5 months, Chagatai and Ogadai became increasingly frustrated. Their father had already moved on to other objectives. They were supposed to take the city quickly and join the main campaign. Instead, they were stuck under the walls of Otrar, taking casualties, achieving no success. Inside the city, by contrast, morale was quite high. They had held out longer than anyone expected. Perhaps the Mongols weren't invincible after all. But then, in February 1220, a general named Karacha, one of the president's appointed commanders sent to reinforce, made a decision. He felt no loyalty to the president. He felt no loyalty to Inalchuk. He saw how this war was developing. The Mongols had taken other cities. They were winning every battle. Karacha did the math and decided his best chance for survival was to switch sides. In the middle of the night, Karacha ordered his troops to open one of the gates. The Mongols poured in. The garrison, caught by surprise, was slaughtered in their sleep. The bulk of Inalchuk's army was killed before they could even realize what was happening. The city fell within hours. But here's the thing about Karacha's betrayal. He thought he had made a clever move. He had handed the city over to the Mongols. Surely they would reward him, right? Give him a place in the new order. The Mongols killed him and all his men. When asked why, the Mongol commanders reportedly replied, "We have no need for traitors. If you betrayed your lord, you will betray us." This message reverberated throughout the region. Surrender early or resist to the end, but don't switch sides in the middle. Meanwhile, Inalchuk and perhaps 1/10 of his original garrison, maybe 1,000 men, retreated to the inner citadel, this fortress within a fortress, the last redoubt, and they held out for another month. Think about it. The main city had fallen. Most of its soldiers were dead. There was no relief, no hope, and Inalchuk continued to fight. The Mongols stormed the citadel again and again. They were taking heavy losses. Inalchuk's archers were skilled. His remaining soldiers were motivated. They knew they were doomed anyway. Finally, the Mongols breached the inner walls. They fought room by room, floor by floor. On the very top level of the citadel, Inalchuk was left with only 2 bodyguards. He had run out of arrows, run out of weapons, and then he began throwing bricks. Sources specifically highlight this detail. Governor Inalchuk, by whose greed this entire war had begun, the man who had callously murdered 450 merchants, now stood atop his citadel, throwing bricks at the Mongols who were climbing up to kill him. He reportedly killed several of them before he was finally overcome. However, he was taken alive. Genghis Khan had given his sons orders to bring Inalchuk back breathing. His punishment became legendary. Some sources claim Genghis Khan ordered molten silver poured into Inalchuk's eyes and ears, a deliberate irony, as his greed for silver had been the cause of it all. Other sources describe different tortures. The exact method varies, but the outcome is the same. Inalchuk died slowly and painfully, while Genghis Khan watched. Then, the Mongols systematically destroyed Otrar. They killed most of its population and enslaved the survivors. They destroyed the walls, the irrigation systems, and burned everything that could burn. Otrar, essentially, ceased to exist as a functioning city. When Timur passed by 150 years later, it still lay in ruins. But this is what I want you to understand. While Chagatai and Ogadai were stuck at Otrar for a full 5 months, Genghis Khan, with the main army, was not idle. They were preparing to do something that everyone thought impossible. October 1219, somewhere within the Khwarezmian Empire, President Muhammadu II is at his command center, studying maps and receiving reports from scouts. The news is alarming, but not catastrophic. Jochi's army is moving along the Sir Daria, taking small towns. Chagatai and Ogadai are stuck at Otrar. Jebe and Subutai are exploring the southeastern approaches. But where is Genghis Khan? And where is the main army? Muhammadu's scouts can't find them. The last time they were seen was near Otrar, but then they simply disappeared. Gone, without a trace, with 50,000 men. Muhammadu's advisors debated. Perhaps they had retreated for the winter. Perhaps they were gathering supplies. Perhaps they weren't actually as strong as they seemed. Muhammadu allowed himself to relax a little. Otrar was holding. Samarkand was well defended. His strategy seemed to be working. Let the Mongols wear themselves out against stone walls. Eventually, they would give up and go home. He had no idea that Genghis Khan was now leading 50,000 horsemen across the Kyzylkum Desert, the Red Sands, 300 miles of absolute hell on earth. Let me paint you a picture. Temperatures during the day reach 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, and at night, they drop to near freezing. There is no water, no vegetation, no shelter. Medieval cartographers literally marked this region as impassable, and Genghis Khan marched an army through it. How? First, Mongol cavalry tactics. Each soldier rode not just one horse but had 3 or 4 with him. When one grew tired, he would switch to a fresh one. The tired horse would follow behind, recovering. This allowed Mongol cavalry to cover distances that would have killed European knights. Second, iron discipline. Nobody broke formation. Nobody deviated from course. Water was strictly rationed. Anyone who took more than their share was immediately put to death. Third, and crucially, Genghis Khan had guides. The Mongols had absorbed the Kara Kitai, who had previously controlled this region. They possessed local knowledge. They knew of hidden wells. They knew of routes that caravans had used for centuries, routes inaccessible to most armies due to their difficulty, and they understood that if they could pull this off, they would emerge precisely where Muhammadu least expected them. The march took weeks. Men died, horses died, but they kept moving, and then, in early February 1220, they emerged from the southern edge of the Kyzylkum, 300 miles behind Muhammadu's defensive lines. They were at Bukhara, February 10th, 1220. The people of Bukhara, looking north, saw approaching clouds of dust like an army raises, but this was impossible. North of Bukhara was only the Kyzylkum. Nobody could cross that desert, let alone with an army. The dust clouds approached. People began to panic. Bukhara was one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world. The Dome of Islam in the east, a population of around 300,000. A library with 45,000 books, architecture that rivaled Baghdad. It was a center of knowledge, culture, and wealth, and it had a garrison of around 20,000 soldiers, under the command of Khwarezmian officers who suddenly realized they were facing Genghis Khan's main army. Completely isolated, with no support within 300 miles, they made a decision to attack. It wasn't the worst idea. In fact, if they had stayed within the walls, they would have eventually been starved out. But if they could break through the Mongol lines, they could either flee to Samarkand and regroup, or at least die fighting rather than trapped. The garrison marched out of Bukhara to give battle. The Mongols annihilated them. It wasn't even close to an even fight. The Bukhara garrison, numbering around 20,000, faced a 50,000-man Mongol cavalry force that had just crossed the desert and showed no mercy. The battle raged on the banks of the Amu Darya River, and it turned into a slaughter. Those who did not die in battle tried to swim the river. Most drowned. Only a few made it to the other side and scattered into the surrounding countryside. The garrison was completely destroyed. The city authorities, looking at the walls of Bukhara and the Mongol army beyond, quickly assessed the situation and decided to surrender, opening the gates. Genghis Khan entered Bukhara like a legendary conqueror. He immediately headed to the city's main mosque, its holiest place, and according to many sources, he climbed the minbar, the pulpit from which imams usually preached. The city dwellers, gathered in the courtyard, were forced to watch. Terrified, they knew the fate of cities that had resisted the Mongols. Genghis Khan spoke, not in Mongolian, but through a translator. He declared, "O people, know that you have committed great sins, and the great among you have committed these sins. If you ask me, what proof do I have of these words? I say it is because I am the scourge of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent such a punishment as me upon you." Think about the psychological impact of those words. You are not fighting a man, but divine retribution. Your own sins have brought this upon you. This is brilliant and terrifying propaganda. What followed was systematic and brutal. The Mongols divided the population into groups. The first group, artisans, engineers, scribes, anyone with useful skills was spared, but enslaved. They were sent to Mongolia to work in Mongol workshops for the rest of their lives. The second group, men of fighting age who had not resisted, were forcibly recruited into the Mongol army to serve as cannon fodder in future sieges. The third group, all others were enslaved and distributed among the Mongol officers. The surrendered members of the garrison were executed to a man. Genghis Khan's rule was clear: resist and die, or surrender immediately. But if you surrender after fighting, you will still die. Then, the Mongols looted the city, taking everything of value. And either by accident or design, a fire broke out. Perhaps it was cooking fires left unattended. Perhaps it was deliberate. In any case, Bukhara, this city of wood and straw that had stood for 500 years, burned down. When the Mongols finally left, Bukhara was a smoking ruin, and the Dome of Islam in the east had turned to ash. But the strategic genius in this maneuver was evident. Genghis Khan was now west of Samarkand. He had cut the capital off from any support from Bukhara or western cities. He had proven he could go anywhere, strike anywhere. The impossible march across the desert had become not just a tactical victory, but psychological warfare. President Muhammadu, upon hearing the news, finally understood what he was facing, but it was too late. All roads now led to Samarkand. If this story has moved you, hit the subscribe button. This is the level of detailed historical narrative you won't find anywhere else, and we are only just getting to the main event. Early March 1220. Samarkand sits on the Zarafshan River, in the heart of Central Asia. If Bukhara was beautiful, Samarkand was magnificent. It was a city of 200,000 people, supported by an engineering marvel, an aqueduct system that brought water from mountains tens of miles away to this city on the steppe. It was famous for its artisans, its weavers, whose work was prized across Asia, its blacksmiths, who created brass lamps that lit palaces from China to Cairo, its weavers, who produced brocade from silver thread, worth more than gold. This was the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, the seat of President Muhammad's power, and it was about to become a graveyard. The city's defenses were formidable: massive walls, layered fortifications, a citadel within the city that could have withstood even if the outer walls fell. Garrison numbers vary wildly in the sources. Medieval chroniclers writing under Mongol patronage, like Juwayni and Rashid al-Din, claimed 100,000 to 110,000 defenders. Ibn al-Athir named 50,000. Modern historians, estimating the city's size and population, suggest around 10,000 to 20,000 actual soldiers. But regardless of the actual numbers, they had something special: 20 war elephants. These were Asian elephants, brought from India, trained for war, with towers on their backs where archers sat. They were armored, enormous, and the Khwarezmian commanders considered them their trump card. The Mongols had never fought war elephants. They had never even seen an elephant. How would horse archers deal with these living tanks? There was only one problem with the defenses: morale. News from Bukhara had reached Samarkand. The soldiers knew the Mongols had crossed an impassable desert. They knew Bukhara had fallen in a matter of days. They knew what had happened to the garrison: utter annihilation, and worse, a significant portion of the army were nomadic Turks. Their cultural ties to the Mongols were stronger than their ties to the Persian president. There are records of some Turkic warriors in Samarkand, upon learning of the Mongols' approach, explicitly stating, "We are of the same tribe as them. Why should we die for the president?" The loyalty of the garrison was, at best, questionable. And here's the biggest problem. Where was President Muhammad II? He was supposed to be in the capital, rallying troops, preparing for defense. But Muhammadu was outside the city with the remnants of his mobile forces. Watching from afar, the president was already contemplating escape routes. The Mongol forces were closing in on Samarkand like wolves surrounding wounded prey. From the west, Genghis Khan and Tolui, with the main army, having just finished ravaging Bukhara. From the east, Chagatai and Ogadai, finally finished with Otrar, eager to prove themselves after a long siege. From the north, Jochi, who had consolidated his hold on the Sirdarya region, his cavalry hardened by months of fighting. From the southeast, Jebe and Subutai, the unmatched masters of maneuver warfare, 4 separate armies, perfectly synchronized, arriving within days of each other. The Mongols approached the city from both banks of the Zarafshan River, and by early March, Samarkand found itself encircled, not just surrounded, but sealed, hermetically sealed. Mongol cavalry patrolled the entire city. Every road was blocked. Every pathway was observed. Nobody could enter. Nobody could leave. The Mongols even intercepted merchant caravans that were unaware of the city's siege, capturing them before they could warn or deliver supplies. And then Genghis Khan began his psychological warfare. First, he paraded his prisoners from Bukhara before the walls of Samarkand. But here's a stroke of genius. He gave them Mongol battle standards to carry. From a distance, it looked like the Mongol army was twice as large as it actually was. The defenders saw approximately 200,000 soldiers besieging them. Second, he deliberately allowed some prisoners to escape, but only after they had been thoroughly terrified. These men flee into Samarkand, penetrate the walls, and tell horrific tales of Mongol brutality. They describe massacres, arson, systematic destruction. They are not lying. They have seen it all. But their presence also complicates the city's food supply and sows panic. Third, the siege engines arrived. Remember those Chinese engineers? They built trebuchets and mangonels, effectively medieval artillery. These machines were capable of throwing 300-pound stones over walls from hundreds of feet away. They could also launch pots filled with naphtha, a petroleum-based incendiary, essentially medieval napalm. The bombardment begins. Boom, boom, boom. Day and night, stones batter the outer walls. Pots of naphtha arc over the fortifications, exploding into flames on impact. The outer districts of Samarkand begin to burn. Wooden structures ignite, and smoke rises over the city. Inside Samarkand, the people are gripped by terror. This bombardment is unlike anything they have ever experienced. The sheer noise is psychologically devastating. The constant thudding, the screams, the sound of stone on stone, and then Genghis Khan does something even more brutal. He uses the prisoners from Bukhara as human shields. He drives them ahead of his attacks. As the Mongols assault the walls, these prisoners, civilians from Bukhara, are forced to go first. The defenders on the walls face a horrific choice: shoot their fellow Muslims, or allow the Mongols to advance. Most choose to shoot. But every arrow that kills a civilian from Bukhara is another blow to morale. The psychological burden is unbearable. This continues for 3 days. 3 days of bombardment, 3 days of failed assaults, 3 days of watching the Mongol noose tighten. And then, on the 3rd day, the Samarkand garrison makes a decision. They will sortie. The 3rd day of the siege, inside Samarkand, the military command holds an emergency council. "We cannot just sit here," argues one. "Every day of delay weakens us. The bombardment is destroying morale. People are beginning to talk of surrender. We must break their siege." Another adds, "If we can punch through their lines, we can either retreat to regroup, or at least inflict enough casualties to make them reconsider. We have the elephants," adds a 3rd commander. "The Mongols have never faced war elephants. They will panic." This is not entirely insane logic. Elephants in ancient and medieval warfare were as much psychological weapons as physical ones. They are huge. They are terrifying. And cavalry horses, unaccustomed to them, will panic and bolt. The decision is made. A full-scale sortie. They will use the 20 war elephants as the vanguard, followed by cavalry. Approximately 20,000 to 25,000 men. This is about half the garrison. The plan is to break through the Mongol lines, scatter them, and perhaps lift the siege. At the very least, they will inflict serious damage on the enemy, showing the Mongols that Samarkand will not surrender without a fight. The gates swing open. First out come the 20 war elephants. They are majestic, terrifying creatures, 10-foot giants at the shoulder, with sharpened tusks, armored heads and flanks, with towers on their backs where archers sit. Behind them come waves of cavalry, the elite of the Samarkand garrison, ready to exploit any breakthrough the elephants provide. The Mongol troops see them approaching. And this is important. Mongol warriors have never seen elephants. These creatures look like they've stepped out of a nightmare. For a moment, you can imagine the Mongol cavalry shifting nervously, their horses whinnying in fear. And then, the Mongols turn and flee. The front rank of the Mongol cavalry abruptly turns and gallops away from the advancing elephants. Not in panic, too organized for panic, but clearly retreating. The Khwarezmian commanders, seeing this, feel a surge of hope. It's working. The elephants are working. They charge with renewed vigor. The elephants trumpet. The cavalry urges their horses on. They are about to break through. They are about to. The Mongol cavalry stops its retreat. They have lured the sortie about a mile from the city walls. Far enough for the elephants and cavalry to be fully engaged. Far enough for the retreat back to the city to be difficult. And then, on Genghis Khan's signal, the trap springs shut. Mongol cavalry, previously hidden behind hills and in valleys, suddenly appear on both flanks, or their iconic Mongol formation closes in. The sortie force finds itself surrounded on 3 sides, with the only avenue of retreat back towards Samarkand, now a mile away across open ground. Arrows begin to rain down like a storm. This is what the Mongols do better than anyone else in the world: mobile archery. Their composite bows could pierce armor from 200 yards, and their tens of thousands all firing in coordinated volleys. The elephants, these mighty war machines, suffer first. Arrows strike them from all sides, not necessarily fatal shots. Elephant hide is thick, but it hurts. Arrows embed themselves in their flanks, their legs, their trunks. The elephants begin to panic, and a panicked elephant is more dangerous to its own side than the enemy. The elephants trumpet in pain and fear. Some bolt, others mill about in random directions, including back towards their own lines. Some fall. The towers on their backs tip archers onto the ground. Horses panic as elephants crash into cavalry formations. The carefully organized sortie descends into chaos, and then the Mongol heavy cavalry attacks. These are not light archers. These are 40% of the Mongol army, armored, with lances, trained for shock combat. They crash into the disorganized Khwarezmian cavalry like a hammer through glass. What follows is not a battle, it's a slaughter. The Khwarezmian forces try to retreat to the city, but the Mongols close the distance. Cavalry fleeing across open ground cannot fight effectively. They are cut down by the thousands, some reaching the gates. Perhaps a few hundred out of 25,000. The rest perish in the field. The 20 war elephants. The Mongols actually captured most of them alive. They are impressed by these creatures and think they might be useful. But elephants require specific food and care. Asian elephants from India cannot survive in the Central Asian steppe. Within weeks, all 20 elephants die of starvation and stress. But the immediate impact is devastating. Samarkand has just lost half its garrison. The best troops, the most motivated soldiers, those willing to fight, are gone. The defenders on the walls watched it all. They saw the trap, they saw the slaughter, they saw their best hope perish in the dust outside the city. Morale doesn't just fall, it collapses. And it is then that President Muhammadu II makes his fatal decision. President Muhammadu II watches the disaster unfold from a hill a few miles from the city. He had tried to help. He truly had. Twice he had tried to bring reinforcements to break through to Samarkand. On the first attempt, he was intercepted by Subutai. His troops were driven back with heavy losses. A second attempt was again blocked by Jochi's cavalry. He was forced to retreat. Muhammadu stands on that hill, watching the sortie being destroyed. He sees his capital, his jewel, his seat of power, isolated and doomed, and he makes a choice that will go down in history as one of the most cowardly acts ever committed by a medieval ruler. He flees. President Muhammadu II, the second Alexander, ruler of an empire stretching from China to the Persian Gulf, abandons his capital. He doesn't inform his generals. He doesn't inform his troops. He simply takes his son Jalal al-Din, a few hundred loyal guards, and flees west. When the news of the president's flight reaches Samarkand, the effect is instantaneous and catastrophic. The president has left us. These 5 words spread throughout the city. The defenders, who had not yet broken and were ready to continue fighting, had been waiting for reinforcements, believing in salvation from their president, finally succumbed to panic. Bitter arguments erupt among the commanders. Some insist on continuing the fight. Others propose surrender. The Turkic contingents, not keen on being there, begin to whisper about opening the city gates. Inside Samarkand, panic reigns. Food is becoming scarce. Water is rationed on a strict schedule. The city is under constant bombardment day and night, and the ruler, meanwhile, has abandoned them. The empire had not just lost. In effect, there had been betrayal. Sources differ on whether it was the 4th or 5th day of the siege, but it was less than a week after the Mongols appeared that Samarkand, its main part, surrendered. The gates were opened. A delegation of chiefs, carrying white flags, emerged from the city, begging for mercy. Genghis Khan received them. He agreed to accept the surrender, and even promised that civilians who cooperated would be spared. The garrison, what was left of it, left the city. They laid down their arms, fulfilling the terms of surrender. Perhaps they expected enslavement or forced labor, but importantly, they believed they would live. Genghis Khan ordered them all executed, every single one, 20,000 to 30,000. Surrendered soldiers were led out onto the fields outside the city walls and systematically destroyed. Mostly, they were beheaded, but to save time, some were trampled by horses. Why? Genghis Khan had a strict rule, recorded in many sources. Cities that surrendered immediately would be spared. Those who resisted would be destroyed. Cities that surrendered after resistance would lose their garrison, but civilians might survive. Samarkand held out for 4 days before surrendering, which was deemed too long. The garrison was doomed. This was calculated terror, a message to all other cities in the empire. Surrender at once, or perish. However, a small contingent in the citadel, a fortress within Samarkand, refused to surrender. Probably around 1,000 soldiers, the most hardened veterans, those with nothing left to lose. They barricaded themselves and prepared for a final stand. For a full month, they held out. The Mongols stormed the citadel repeatedly, taking casualties. These defenders were skilled, desperate, and knew they were doomed anyway. They were determined to take as many Mongols with them as possible. Finally, One night, a small group of defenders made a desperate decision. They were going to attempt a breakout. They knew the odds were slim, but staying meant certain death, so they decided to take their chances. In the dead of night, they fought their way through Mongol outposts. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight. Most died, but several hundred men managed to break through, reach the Amu Darya River, swim across, and disappear into the countryside. The Mongols were so impressed that someone had managed to escape that they apparently let them go out of respect. The remaining defenders of the citadel were killed when the Mongols finally breached the walls. After the fall of the citadel, Samarkand was entirely in Mongol hands. What followed was systematic and ruthless destruction. The population was divided into three groups. The first group, skilled artisans, 30,000 to 50,000 master craftsmen, metal workers, weavers, scribes, doctors. These men were valuable. They were herded into columns and driven east to Karakoram, the Mongol capital. They spent the rest of their lives as slaves in Mongol workshops, creating siege engines and goods for their conquerors. The second group, men of military age. Any man capable of holding a weapon was conscripted into the Mongol army. They were used as cannon fodder in subsequent sieges, forced to carry ladders, push siege towers, and take arrows. Most of them died within months. The third group, all others, women, children, the elderly. They were enslaved and distributed among the Mongol commanders. The women faced what typically awaited women during medieval conquests. The sources do not elaborate, but we know it was horrific. The city itself was systematically plundered. All valuables, gold, silver, jewels, goods, were loaded onto Mongol wagons. The treasury was emptied. Then came the destruction. The Mongols tore down parts of the city walls, not all of them, but enough that the city could no longer be used as a fortress against them. They destroyed the aqueduct system, which meant Samarkand could no longer support a large population. Parts of the city were burned. The death toll across the Khwarezmian Empire is impossible to calculate with certainty. Medieval sources speak of millions. Modern historians estimate that between 10% and 25% of the entire population died, either directly killed or from starvation and disease caused by the destruction of irrigation systems. Entire cities disappeared. Agricultural lands turned into desert because the irrigation canals were destroyed. It took centuries, literally centuries, for some regions to recover. And this is what I want you to understand. This was not just conquest. This was a deliberately planned devastation. The Mongols wanted to send a message that would echo through the generations. Do not resist us. Do not insult us. Never, absolutely never, cross us. And they succeeded. After the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire, other kingdoms and empires, seeing what had happened, chose submission over resistance. The Mongol Empire eventually controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary. And it all began with Governor Inalchuk wanting to steal a little silver. So, what can we learn from this catastrophe? Because that's what history is for, not just to tell stories, but to understand patterns. First, leadership matters. It is almost impossible to overstate how much President Muhammadu II's failures contributed to this disaster. He was paranoid, indecisive, and ultimately cowardly. His decision to divide his troops instead of concentrating them violated every principle of military strategy. His inability to trust his generals meant that no one could coordinate a proper defense, and his abandonment of Samarkand destroyed any remaining morale in his empire. Contrast this with Genghis Khan, focused, decisive, ruthless, and here's the key. He delegated to competent subordinates. He trusted Jebe, Subutai, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Tolui to carry out their missions independently. This trust allowed for a complex multi-front campaign that destroyed Khwarezm. Second, unity beats numbers. The Khwarezmians likely outnumbered the Mongols significantly if all their troops were combined. But these troops were scattered, poorly coordinated, and often disloyal. The Mongols were united, disciplined, cohesive, and acted with perfect coordination across hundreds of miles. 100,000 united soldiers will destroy 400,000 disparate soldiers every single time. Third, technology matters, but tactics matter more. The Khwarezmians had all the ingredients for victory: fortified cities, large armies, and even war elephants, but they lacked the tactics to effectively use these advantages. The war elephants at Samarkand should have been a decisive weapon, but they turned into a catastrophe due to the Mongols' superior tactics. Fourth, pride comes before a fall. Muhammadu called himself the second Alexander and genuinely believed in his own invincibility. He thought he could insult Genghis Khan without consequence. This arrogance cost him everything. Fifth, and this is controversial, but I believe it. Sometimes the winning side isn't the good guys. The Mongols committed atrocities on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Mass murder, deliberate destruction of infrastructure, the use of terror as a weapon. It was evil by any moral standard, but it was effective, and effectiveness in war doesn't care about morality. The Mongol conquest of Khwarezm changed the world. It opened Central Asia to Mongol control, which meant the Great Silk Road, for the first time in centuries, functioned under a single authority. This facilitated trade and cultural exchange between East and West. Paper, gunpowder, and printing technology spread to Europe, partly because the Mongols controlled the routes. The conquest also devastated Islamic civilization in Central Asia. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv, once centers of Islamic learning and culture, saw their intellectual tradition shift westwards to Cairo and Damascus after 1220. This event also laid the groundwork for Mongol expansion. Overwhelming force, terror tactics, and absolute ruthlessness. This strategy led the Mongols to the gates of Vienna and the Middle East. So, here's my controversial take. Was Genghis Khan justified in his revenge? No. Mass murder of civilians can never be justified. But was he predictable? Yes. Muhammadu killed 450 Mongol traders under protection, and then murdered the envoys. He broke all diplomatic norms and essentially provoked Genghis Khan into invading, and then was shocked when it happened. This is injustice. It's simply foolishness meeting consequences. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Was Genghis Khan's reaction justified given the provocation? Or is there no excuse for the level of destruction the Mongols inflicted? I'm interested in your thoughts. March 1220. The ruins of Samarkand smolder under the Central Asian sun. Bodies lie in heaps outside the city walls. The Grand Aqueduct is destroyed. The city, once called the most delightful paradise on earth, has become a graveyard. It remained so for 150 years. Then, in 1370, another conqueror looked at these ruins and saw potential. His name was Timur, or Tamerlane as Western historians called him. He was a descendant of Mongol warriors and chose Samarkand as his capital. Timur rebuilt the city, turning it into something magnificent. He constructed the Registan, a famous square surrounded by madrasas, with their stunning blue tilework. He also erected mosques, palaces, and gardens, inviting artisans from across his empire to restore Samarkand's reputation as a center of art and scholarship. The irony is that the city destroyed by the Mongols was rebuilt by their descendants into one of the most beautiful cities in the Islamic world. Today, Samarkand is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists come to see the architecture created by Timur. The ancient citadel of Afrosiab, the pre-Mongol city, remains an archaeological site, abandoned since 1220. The city endured. The buildings didn't survive, but the place remained. And that's the essence of history. Empires fall, rulers die, armies are defeated, but places remain. Stories live on, lessons are preserved. The fall of Samarkand teaches us something that is still relevant today: pride and ignorance, a deadly combination. President Muhammadu II thought he was powerful enough to insult anyone. He was wrong, and it cost him his empire and millions of lives. Respect your enemies, understand what you are up against, and never, ever underestimate someone simply because they are different from you. The Khwarezmians looked at the Mongols and saw primitive nomads. They didn't see organizational genius, tactical flexibility, ruthless efficiency. By the time they realized what they were dealing with, it was too late. In 1218, a caravan of 450 merchants arrived in a frontier town, hoping to trade. In 1220, an empire was erased from history. In 1221, President Muhammadu II died alone on an island, a broken man who had destroyed his own legacy, and Genghis Khan continued his conquests. He would invade the Jin dynasty again, campaign in India, and lay the foundations for an empire that would eventually control half the known world. And all of it began with one moment, one decision, one insult. 20 war elephants trapped. Allah chose pride over survival. And the city of Samarkand learned what it meant to face the wrath of the Mongols. The story of Samarkand is a story of how quickly things can collapse, how quickly an empire can fall, how thoroughly history can be rewritten by decisive action and overwhelming force. This story speaks of the consequences of arrogance, the results of incompetent rule, and the price of underestimating opponents. The outcome of this story: Central Asia was turned to ash, the greatest cities of the Silk Road became ruins, and an empire once spanning Asia was reduced to a footnote in history books in less than 3 years. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most brutal campaigns in history. If you made it to the end, you are a true history connoisseur, and I deeply appreciate that. Hit the like button, subscribe for more content like this, and let me know in the comments what historical period we should explore next.